Goge Vandire was a man who simultaneously held the reins of both the Adeptus Administratum and the Ecclesiarchy. Sometime in the 36th millennium, through a combination of overt and covert machinations, he rose to become the 361st Master of the Administratum. Vandire was notoriously treacherous and maintained deep, shadowy ties with the Officio Assassinorum. Within the Terran government, anyone who dared speak ill of him would soon vanish mysteriously or meet with a fatal accident. Consequently, few within the Administratum dared to oppose his decrees. In contrast, the Ecclesiarch at the time, Paulis III, was a conservative and utterly incompetent figure. Many believed that his ascension was secretly orchestrated by the Administratum to ensure a weak leadership in the Church, as the ambitious Vandire planned to seize even more power amidst the chaos of the raging warp storms. For centuries, the various departments of Terra had grown accustomed to the established rules of political negotiation. When the Ecclesiarchy assumed that by appointing Paulis III they would receive favorable political responses from the Administratum as in the past, they were met instead with cold violence. As the new Ecclesiarch indulged in a life of luxury and public confidence in the Church plummeted, Vandire saw his long-awaited opportunity. He led a heavily armed force in a direct raid on Paulis III's private chambers. When his soldiers burst into the bedroom, the fool was still engaged in debauchery with his servants. Without any semblance of a trial, the Ecclesiarch was summarily executed by Vandire on charges of heresy. Immediately following the execution, the Administratum launched a public campaign of condemnation against the Ecclesiarchy, using Paulis III's disgraceful lifestyle as an indelible stain on the organization's reputation. Before the Church's private military, the Frateris Templar, could react due to the interference of the warp storms, the well-prepared Vandire launched a ruthless purge of all ecclesiastical personnel stationed on Terra. High-ranking clergy were condemned, and even the most pious bishops were arrested on trumped-up charges of heresy. A small number of church officials who managed to flee Terra by ship toward Ophelia 7 were swallowed by the warp storms shortly after entering the Imperium.
Vandire watched these events with cold satisfaction, proclaiming that the deaths of these heretics were the will of the Emperor, and that he himself had been chosen as the master of mankind's new mouthpiece. He subsequently declared himself the new Ecclesiarch, assuming control over the very organization he had just dismantled. He replaced the leadership of every department with his own loyal followers, and as the Imperium fractured under the weight of Xenos and Chaos threats, Goge Vandire quietly became a High Lord with absolute control over two major pillars of power. Thus began the bloody era known as the Reign of Blood. If Draken Vankorich, the Grand Master of Assassins who rose to power after the War of the Beast, was a tragic, proactive idealist, eventually crushed by the weight of imperial reality, Goge Vandire was a purely self-serving egoist. This shrewd and mad tyrant established a vast spy network. Countless innocents were imprisoned, tortured, and tormented, simply to ensure absolute obedience. Vandire spent much of his time obsessing over a galactic data map, a device that allowed him to track the status of the Imperium's worlds in detail. Whenever a world re-established contact with Terra, Vandire would immediately dispatch a fleet to impose his will. If a planet's inhabitants failed to show sufficient enthusiasm for his envoys, they faced punishments as severe as exterminatus. This High Lord cared nothing for the future of humanity. He craved only total authority. Through his network of informants, Vandire learned that not all Imperial factions were willing to submit. Chief among these were the Space Marine chapters and the Adeptus Mechanicus, both of whom maintained high degrees of autonomy and held beliefs distinct from the Ecclesiarchy's dogma. Although these powerful organizations were largely distracted by the chaos of the warp storms, the worlds under their control steadfastly refused Vandire's direct management. Reports of growing dissent continued to flood in. While Vandire could manipulate the Council of High Lords through his dual grip on the Administratum and the Church, he could not easily use the Imperial Guard or the Navy to suppress the Astartes or the Mechanicus, as those branches were not entirely under his thumb. The remnants of the Frateris Templar, though well-equipped, lacked the scale of the regular military. This led Vandire to seek out a new martial force that would be entirely loyal to him alone.
Vandire's attention was eventually caught by a report from San Leor, a remote agricultural world in the Ultima Segmentum. The report mentioned a unique sect of the Imperial Creed known as the Daughters of the Emperor, a small group of approximately 500 fanatical female believers. This organization was exclusive to women, Only those of the most unwavering piety were permitted to join. These sisters spent their lives within their convent, honing their bodies and spirits to a razor edge, ready to fight for their vision of the God Emperor. They were the most devoted and uncompromising warriors born of the Ecclesiarchy's teachings. The cunning Vandire immediately recognized their value. As the officially designated mouthpiece of the Emperor on Terra, he knew that with a bit of trickery, he could bring these simple-minded and devout warriors under his command. Vandire organized a massive fleet and traveled to San Leor. Upon the Ecclesiarch's arrival, every inhabitant of the planet, from newborn infants to the elderly, was forced to gather at his landing site to greet him. Those who dared to protest were executed by secret agents. Vast crowds lined the road to the convent, and every move Vandire made was broadcast as propaganda to every world under his rule. However, when he reached the convent, the daughters of the emperor refused him entry. To these radicals, it mattered not if a man was a high lord of Terra, they served only the god emperor. This reaction was exactly what Vandire had anticipated. Adopting a false humility, he entered the convent with only a single guard and knelt before a statue of the emperor. After a staged prayer, he stood and ordered his guard to open fire on him. This act immediately drew the sisters' attention. Vandire claimed that the master of mankind had granted him a divine shroud of protection, that as the chosen representative, no mortal weapon could harm his body. Though the guard was visibly reluctant, he followed Vandire's order and pulled the trigger at the High Lord's chest. In an instant, a brilliant, transparent halo of light shimmered around Vandire, deflecting the bolter rounds and leaving him completely unharmed. The witnesses were stunned. Vandire's guards fell to their knees in reverence, and the sisters, believing they had witnessed a genuine miracle, accepted the Ecclesiarch as the true avatar of the emperor.
Vandire allowed a sinister, hidden smile to cross his face as he touched the rosarius beads concealed on his person, the force field generator that had made the deception possible. After accepting their oath of fealty, Vandire brought the sisters back to Terra to serve as his personal praetorian guard. He renamed them the Brides of the Emperor and subjected these fanatical women to rigorous military training under the finest instructors of the Imperial Guard. As his private army, they were granted the most advanced equipment available to mortals, including tailored power armor and high-grade bolters. They were his trump card for any future conflict with the Astartes or the Mechanicus. The unveiling of a force whose equipment and combat resolve far exceeded that of the regular Imperial Guard sent shockwaves through the Imperium. For years, the Brides of the Emperor protected this self-proclaimed envoy with absolute devotion. While many within the Terran government harbored murderous intent toward the mad Vandire, every assassination attempt was thwarted by the layers of security provided by these female warriors. During this period, Vandire inflicted catastrophic damage upon the Imperium, squandering the Church's vast resources and using his spy network to target his enemies. Countless worlds withered under his tyranny. At the height of his power, he effectively bypassed the Council of High Lords, controlling the Administratum, the Church, and indirectly influencing the assassins and the military. While the frontline defenders of the Imperium bled and died against Xenos and Chaos, Vandire's fleets systematically plundered worlds that had only recently re-established contact with Terra, funneling all resources toward maintaining his own seat of power. The Imperial Palace on Terra fell into a state of true decay. Once grand halls stood empty, and priceless chandeliers and carpets became nests for rodents. Jewel-encrusted windows were caked in sickening filth, and the corridors were haunted only by the occasional footsteps of the Brides of the Emperor on patrol. As time wore on, Vandire, sequestered within his heavily fortified chambers, descended further into madness. He would oscillate between fits of hysterical screaming and days of catatonic silence, kept functioning only through massive doses of drugs. Scribes permitted into his presence noted that the terrifying old man's fear of his own mortality was becoming overwhelming.
After decades of this madness, the warp storms finally began to show signs of receding. Vandire knew his villainous end was approaching, but the dying High Lord would not go quietly. He had been completely corrupted by power, becoming a threat to the human race as dangerous as any Xenos or demon. His bloody reign proved that the enemies of the Imperium were not only among the stars or within the warp. The greed and lust for power hidden within the human heart could cause equally devastating disasters. Yet, regardless of the trials faced, humanity would survive, for hope had not truly vanished. The man who had sat upon the golden throne for 5,000 years began to turn his ever-watchful gaze away from the battlefields of the warp and toward his mortal government. This chaos had to be ended, for even the master of mankind could not perfectly manage both the material and immaterial realms in such a state. Every prayer from across the stars had been heard. The cold sun still hung high above the Imperium. Though his physical shell was withered and dry, his psychic flames roared with intensity. The game of chess was far from over, and the Emperor's path was quietly being paved throughout the cosmos.